I'm privileged to be here amongst you. I know that time is of essence to you, so I'll get down to the nitty-gritty of what we should be talking today. India is a puzzle to most outsiders. I, as an Indian, always thinks that chaos is normalcy for Indians. And therefore, when foreigners come and see everything chaotic, they get very nervous. But remember that in the last 68 years since India became free of the British clutches, it's a country which has survived as a democracy. Survived is an understatement. In fact, it's functioned vigorously as a democracy. Parties in power have been voted out peacefully, and new parties have come in. It has a constitution which guarantees free speech, and the courts are very effective, and something that you will not see in the neighborhood of India or in vast parts of the world. And it's a country which was predicted to fall apart because a false impression was given by the British that India is a country put together by the British. But in fact, it was not. And as a consequence, India is not broken up as predicted by Winston Churchill or Richard Nixon. It's a country that is, in terms of its existence, as stable as it can be. Our neighbor Pakistan broke into two, the Soviet Union broke into 16, Yugoslavia broke into 4, Indonesia into 2, so the Czechoslovakia broke into 2. So I think all over the world you see countries breaking up. But the country which was most predicted to break up did not, because people misunderstood India. It's a land in which the people love to argue, people love to differ, but they don't kill each other for having different views. So it's a democratic country. It's a country with an enormous history. It was the most developed country of the world 1,000 years ago by the studies now done by OECD in Paris. And most scholars who have studied that have agreed with it. At one stage, India singly owned 36% of the GDP of the world GDP. And with China, it was more than 50%. And afterwards, due to certain external circumstances, externally created circumstances, colonialism, invasion of Islamic hordes, the country lost and bled, and ultimately, although it survived, it became a very poor country in 1947. At that time, we made a wrong decision on the economy, because the people who understood the Indian economy, like Mahatma Gandhi and Sardar Patel, had died by then, by 2 years, 3 years, within 2-3 years of our independence. And Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru, he was totally persuaded that the best way to develop is by the Soviet economic model. Now, unfortunately, the Soviet economic model was predicated on the assumption that you could extract resources from agriculture to finance industrialization. It was okay to some extent for the Soviet Union because they had an agricultural revolution by 1916, and therefore the model was successful up to a point, at least a few decades, because it was able to extract resources from agriculture. But the Indian agriculture had been bled very systematically by the British, by the system they created of landlordism, which we call as zamindari. And by 1947, agriculture was bone dry. And therefore, the question of it providing resources for industrialization didn't exist. So the model failed very soon. We were not able to achieve a growth rate of more than 3%. And in 1990, When I became part of the government, and for the continuing remaining 6 years, I was part of the first government of Mr. Chandrasekhar and then Mr. Narasimha Rao. We worked on economic reforms, and what was 3% per year for 40 years, within 5 years we made it to rise to 9% per year. So what I'm giving you this example is to show that whatever is said about India, if it is negative, it will be disproved. Because there's nothing that one can say with India which India cannot surmount. India has had crises and produced solutions. We had a terrible food crisis in 1966 and survived for at least a year because the Americans were able to send what was called the PL-480 grain by ships. And within 2 years of that terrible shortage in food grains, we had begun the process of reform, and a term which has been widely used around the world, India produced a green revolution. And within 10 years, we were exporting food grains. And we are today in a stage where we don't know where to keep our food grains when there's a bumper production. That much production has increased. Of course, that doesn't mean people in India are not under less than optimal nutrition. It's not true that people in India are not poor. But that's in a way looking at the glass as half full or half empty. If you're an optimist, you'll say it's half full. And if you're a pessimist, you'll say it's half empty. But I would say that my experience with India has been that every problem, when it becomes a crisis, gets solved and we then move on. For long years we were told that democracy is not suitable for a country which has so many illiterate people. But in the 1975-77 period, when Mrs. Gandhi suspended the constitution and took over as dictator, it just took 20 months for India to throw her out and restore democracy. So I think the first thing I would like to say to you about India is, and as investors I'm sure you're interested to know, it's a very stable country. We have orderly transitions, and we have elections where the authority of the elected leaders prevails over all sections of the government, whether it's the military or whether it's the intelligence or whether it is the provincial governments. There are countries which have elections, but they are not able to prevail over the other forces. The example is of Pakistan, where they have an elected government, but they cannot make any decision unless the army and the intelligence concurs with the civilian government. So it's in this context today I'll speak to you a few things about doing business in India. There's no doubt that if you look at the index for doing business in India, we come pretty poor down the list. Maybe we are 134th out of 195 countries or something like that. But that index is structured in such a way that many of the things which are mentioned are given equal weight with many of the things on which we get a very high rating. Yes, there is no doubt there is a bureaucracy. We have, despite the economic reforms, we have basically only so far managed to bring about deregulation of the Indian economy. The highly regulated Soviet system has been replaced now by a deregulated system. You don't need any more licenses to set up an industry. You don't need any quotas to get your raw materials. Market forces work. So the first thing I would suggest to you is, India is not a place where you come and you see everything going through in a streamlined way. We are still in the process of recovering from what I would call as 1,000 years of instability and foreign attacks, and coming out of a 40-year period of Soviet economic system. And therefore, it's nobody's case or nobody's argument that India is a place where you just land and then everything will go through smoothly, not yet anyway. But I would say that amongst the most of the countries of the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, India has advantages which should appeal to all of you, particularly the soft power of India. Yes, it's true that in China decisions get made more efficiently, and even if you have to bribe anybody, you have to just bribe the fellow at top and then everything else falls in place. Whereas you will be probably harassed all along the line, including when you want an electricity connection. But the fact is that this in India, there is no question of your property being confiscated one blue morning. There is no question of laws not being enforced by courts, if not by the police. There are systems in place. There is no country in the whole of Asia, I think, except perhaps Japan, which can compare with India's legal system. And that legal system continues to improve day by day. So you got to take this into account. You come, you will be protected on your property rights. Intellectual property rights will be protected. We conform to the international definition of intellectual property rights. So therefore, on that you're safe. You're not safe there on that in China. Two, we have a stable political system which functions according to democratic principles. We have a written constitution. Now, the question therefore is, where are the problems you're likely to face in India? And is there a hope that this might be changed? The foremost problem that most people complain is corruption. Especially you from United States, if you were to do business in India, you will have a problem with your Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. People do get caught. And just now, a Goa chief minister and a Goa minister is facing trial because one of your companies here was prosecuted, and in the process they found out that they had bribed two Indian officials, and there's a prosecution take place. If you're French, you won't have a problem because they are, I think, a little more relaxed about corruption than you Americans. So therefore, there is a problem of corruption. But there is also a new development in India which we never foresaw before, and which is the fight against corruption is equally visible. And therefore there is a public furor when there is a corrupt act. People get affected if there is a complaint on corruption. That's a new development. It essentially began with my court case as a class action in the Supreme Court on the question of the sale of 2G spectrums for telecom companies. In that, a minister went to jail, and the spectrum licenses given to 9 companies, which many of them sold to foreign companies, got cancelled. And the fees they paid was not returned to them, and an auction was held. Same thing in coal allotments, the same thing happened. So there are these new developments also about India. And this process has begun to lead to a situation where today, I'm not saying that one party was very corrupt and the other were angels, but today I can say after 1 year that the allegations of corruption against the present government is of marginal value or of marginal significance. It's a question of whether you favored one particular individual in getting a passport or that kind of allegations, or you allowed him to build a hospital without all the permits being cleared. Nobody can object to a hospital being built. But it's no more the old kind of corruption where you lost resources, vast amount of resources, because you didn't price the product according to the market. So that's another major change that has taken place in India. Now, I would say, therefore, what you need to do is to identify areas where there is great promise in India. One of the areas which I would start with, which may not be as modern sounding as some would like, is the area of agriculture. India, for all its reports about poverty and backwardness of agriculture, has the biggest and the largest potential for growth. Because India is a country where you can do agricultural production 12 months of the year. United States, I'm sure that for 5 months, because of snow, you cannot carry out any agricultural activities. So would be true of Europe. So would be true of most parts of China during winter. But India, you can do it for 12 months of the year, which means you can grow 3 crops. At present, India only utilizes 25% of its land for growing more than 1 crop. Now these crops, these agricultural products, they are of major export significance for India. And that major export significance, I'm saying that India would be grateful for those people who came to improve the agriculture of India. To some extent, the Israelis are doing it, but they are doing it much more in the irrigation technology and the harvesting technology. But we want people who come and participate in agricultural activities. You may not want to participate in growing crops in India, because that is something that will tie you down completely. But something which is connected to agriculture. For instance, the export of milk. India has 150 million cows, and its yield is one of the lowest in the world, 200 liters per year. Israel's average is 11,000 liters. And you can imagine that if India's 150 million cows began giving you 11,000 liters, how much milk would be there? And this milk price presently is 1/7 the price in Europe. And therefore the prospect exists, if India could work through the so-called Doha rounds of the WTO, where we are seeking market access to agricultural markets. If somebody could come with the technology for pasteurizing milk, bottling it, and ensuring quality standards and exporting it, all these are not things that our farmers can do. And our Indian government has so far never even touched this subject. But this is an area which I think where you convert Indian agriculture into a globalized exporting enterprise or a sector, that I think would be a major contribution of those who have money and who have interest in doing work in India. The second thing that we need quite a lot is how to utilize the enormous demographic dividend that is being called. There was a time people used to complain that India has a population problem. But now nobody talks about population problem. They talk about what is called as a demographic dividend. And that means a potential dividend. Because now it's recognized by economists that growth is not due to more capital and more labor. Growth is due to rising productivity in the use of capital and labor, which is measured by something called total factor productivity. For example, it has been found now by studies, by economists, that the growth that took place in Europe after Industrial Revolution and the growth that has taken place in the United States in the 20th century, most of it, as high as 55% of it, was due to reasons other than more investment and more labor. It was due to the fact that the graph of production moved upwards. Instead of you moving along the curve upwards, the curve itself moved upwards. And that's due to technology, like what internet has done today for transaction costs and the ability to deal with production units in different parts of the world. So this is something which India can easily contribute to if its labor force is equipped for that kind of work. Of course, we have a layer of very bright people who come to this country, who perform miracles in software. Today we have Microsoft is headed by an Indian. I believe Google is about to be headed by Indian, or is already decided to be headed by Indian. The Indians are there in corporations. Indians are doing extremely well at one level. But the broad masses, what happened is India did not rapidly reduce its population growth. Its population growth is decreasing, but it wasn't rapidly or enforced to decline as the Chinese did by wanting a one child per family. Today the Chinese admit that was a big mistake because their population is aged much faster than they were prepared for. Much of Europe today is due to the fact of aging populations. The average age of an Indian population is 26 only, whereas in China it is 35, United States 37, Europe is 46, and Japan it is 50. So today we have 540 million people below the age of 25. Can we train them to become skilled employees? And for that, it's not going to be possible by just opening more schools and universities. We have to think of new technological ways. Recently, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology discovered an online education system called the EDX, by which you could visually be almost as if you are attending the classes in MIT and Harvard. And by this process, you could even take exams and get graded, and get a degree, not of the same kind as if you were in residence, but still a certificate. So I think educating these people, this young, huge army that we have, that could become potential investors and innovators, that is an area we would really welcome foreign direct investment. The third area where we are very keen is to develop the basic infrastructure. We would like a power grid. If possible, we would like to use technological prowess to build a water grid, because we got a large number of rivers. Some of them flood after the rainy season, and some of them have no water during the 12 months. In South India, the Kaveri dispute between two states of Tamil Nadu and Karnataka is perpetual because there's never enough water in Kaveri. But Godavari, Krishna, they all flow 80 to 90% to the oceans. They have surplus and they create floods every year, year after year. So if we could have a water grid, that would transform our agriculture. But it's not that easy, because digging canals through the Deccan mountains is something which our technological prowess is not sufficient just now. So this is another area. There are areas where India could become less dependent on foreign countries if technology already known is applied. For example, the Japanese are producing by the end of this year a car which will be run on hydrogen fuel cells. It will not use petrol or diesel. Every night you plug in your car to an electric socket, and in the morning it will be ready to go 350 kilometers. And if over a period of time you are able to set recharging instead of petrol bunks, recharging bunks, electrical bunks, then of course it will be like as if you have a car today with with petrol. So that would make a big difference to India, because today 86% of our oil comes from the Middle East, and its vagaries of its prices going up and down unsettles us. So this is another area where technology which reduces our dependence on foreign countries, on vital materials like fuel and others, we are in search of. We have some of these southern states have serious problems with water, a shortage of water. Desalination today is become a major contributor to solving the water problem of Israel, Saudi Arabia and other countries. That is another area where India would really welcome people to come. That really finally brings me to the question of technology. Foreign direct investment, for us, if it transfers technology, no price is too high to pay. No obstacle would be permitted. But if it doesn't cause a technology transfer, then we have to look to see whether there is a level playing field in the proposal. Many industrialists, foreign visitors have expressed disappointment that we have not allowed Walmart to come to India. The reason we have not allowed Walmart to come to India is nothing ideological. Walmart is able to access capital funds at 2-3% interest rates in the United States. And then their proposals come to India, hire our cheap labor, and of course export food if necessary, or package it and so on, set up malls, so on. That is the proposal of Walmart. That means that we have perhaps tens of millions of traders all over India. Trading has been a very traditional activity in India. A large amount of traders. These traders, they get loans from banks at least not less than 12% per year, and generally very often 18%. And they will have to compete for the same cheap labor pool which Walmart would be competing, and therefore the wage rates of this cheap labor would rise. So the Indian farmer, Indian trader would suffer double disadvantage, and there will be millions of them, and there would be risk of going out of business. It caused a huge problem for us. So there is a solution, but that solution is not acceptable to the United States. We say you allow our companies to come to the United States to build roads, houses, and bring Indian labor to do the work. And the United States says that's an immigration problem for them, so they can't allow it. They would like us to allow cheap capital using companies to come to India and participate in our cheap labor pool, but they will not allow us to take our cheap labor to the United States and participate in the low interest capital market of America. Now that's not a level playing field at all, and therefore we will not allow it. So therefore I think this is an area on foreign investment. While the Prime Minister is very enthusiastic about allowing foreign investment to come, some of us who advise him, or speak to him, tell him very clearly that local unemployment should not take place. One of you just recently proposed construction projects which will use Indian labor. That kind of thing will, I am sure, would be welcomed by the government of India. Anything that uses our surplus resources and converts it into assets, that is an activity we would be very strongly in favor and supportive. Similarly, we have resources which need to be updated, used by updating our present technology. For example, we today have 60% of the world's thorium in our country. 60% of the world's thorium is in India. But thorium is not presently used much or any significance, any part of the world. Uranium is used for nuclear reactors. But the uranium supply will be exhausted in another 30, 40 years. And the world will shift to thorium as a source for fueling nuclear reactors. So we could have a head start if we match it, if we define if we improve our technology to the point where we're able to convert the thorium, which is found in monazite form in the sands of India, of the beaches of India, into uranium-233, and then use it in the reactors. If we have already, there were 3 stages to be required to be completed. India has already completed 2 stages, but the 3rd stage is proving to be difficult. There we would welcome assistance from companies. So these are the areas where we are very much in need. But most of all, I think the focus of our government in the future is going to be on innovational activities of foreign companies. We don't want you to come here to India without technology transfer. We don't want you to come here on a basis in which there is an unfair advantage to the foreigner compared to the Indian of equal capacity, as I gave you the example of Walmart. But we would certainly welcome, and as time goes on, there will be, as our confidence goes on in the grip we get on the country, we have professionals, we have civil servants and bureaucrats who are appointed over the long tenure of Congress, who are still loyal to Congress party that is, and for us to bring about personnel changes which would make a difference, which would be more akin and sympathetic to our approach to the problem. But in short, I would say India is an exciting country. It's not a country which will collapse. There are countries which have been run on steroids and have collapsed. 1997 Asian financial crisis is an example. How many countries of Asia, particularly East Asia, collapsed during that period because their financial system was opaque and just required one thing to trigger the whole thing. All that happened is the bond rate in the New York Wall Street rose a percentage point, and money, which was called the hot money, which comes in easy, short term, in Thailand pulled out and went, it was thought by those who had these short-term funds, thought that it would be better to invest in the New York bond market. And this caused a foreign exchange crisis which had a trigger effect, which had a contagion, as it was called, a contagion. It was contagious, and the whole of Asia, East Asia, went under it, and from that most of them have not even recovered yet. Japan is still not to recover, has not recovered from that period. Whereas the previous 25 years, Japan was considered as the fastest growing country, a country that could possibly even overtake United States or even buy up United States. After they bought up Rockefeller and Center, they began to feel that America might be bought by Japan. And suddenly it is all turned around. And the same thing earlier on had happened to the Latin Americans. People thought the next developed country would be Argentina or Brazil. And that's not turned out to be so. Because of the financial crisis. The financial system has to be sufficiently transparent to be able to discharge more and more volumes of transactions. The Indian financial system is a highly developed financial system. During this latest American crisis, but for one silly mistake of corrupt politicians, we would not have been affected at all. The effect came because we had introduced a derivative in India called the participatory note, which was a very skillful camouflaged method of laundering money which was not declared to the income tax, which we call as black money. The black money gets converted through what is called the informal channels we call as hawala, through Dubai and Singapore, into bank deposits in Switzerland and other places. And today we have $2 trillion of Indians' money in illegally deposited abroad in secret banking countries, which there are about 70 of them. That money was enabled by a derivative called participatory note, and through it, it came back to India and legally permitted to come to India, where no disclosure was necessary as to who owned those participatory notes or where they got the money, which is necessary, which is compulsory for everybody else. And that got invested in our real estate and our stock market, causing artificial rises. And so, since it was part of the hot money, it was a foreign investment, not a foreign direct investment. Therefore, when the American market developed liquidity crunch, this money pulled out. In 1 week, $24 billion were withdrawn from India. And that caused a crash in the stock market and the subsequent effect. It had nothing to do with the American banking system affecting our banking system. So I'm saying that short of that indiscretion called participatory notes, which are now trying to abolish, we have a very sound financial system, which is largely transparent, thoroughly regulated, totally unlike China. China, incidentally, I think it is not going to escape a major financial problem very soon, because the whole Chinese model was based on what? It was based on importing from East Asia semi-processed goods and processing it in China, mostly in foreign direct investment aided Chinese companies, and then exported to Europe and America at much higher prices. And so they had a huge surplus of trade with the West and a small deficit of trade with East Asia, because they were only importing from East Asia, and therefore they built this gigantic reserves of $2.5 or $3 trillion. But now, because the wages have risen, there are many companies now which are folding up in China. There are many companies which are not able to pay the wages. There is a much larger and unreported labor agitation going on in China. There's already a threat of explosion of the property bubble. And the banks are almost bankrupt, the state banks, because they've been lending to the state enterprises, which have never been producing profits, and the Chinese could afford to close them down because the cadre was employed there, and the social security system of that was so strong that they couldn't afford to give it up for political reasons. And so in all these matters, the Chinese are vulnerable in a number of accounts. But Indian financial system, I'll say, is a very stable financial system. And therefore, when you come, you are not going to be, there's going to be no nationalization of your property, so that risk is not there. None of you, like in China, are suddenly picked up and put in jail. That can't be done. We have habeas corpus rules. We have one fundamental right which is guaranteed to foreigners is the right to liberty, and to be deprived of it only through due process of law. You are not going to have problems of patents, because we have conformed to the WTO standards. You are not going to have these kinds of problems which you would face in any other country where perhaps you can make more money, but you will have a stable, you can have a perspective of 5-6 years and to recover what you put in, and without a high risk. So this is in the sum total of the situation. I'm an economist, so therefore I know the general picture, but I can't assist you in the industry by industry picture. But any of you makes inquiries to me through email, I'll put it through the proper circles and I get you a reply. But I think broadly speaking, India is on a cusp of a major rise, just as we were on a cusp in 1990 of transforming from a 3% growth rate country, an autarky in our country, to an open economy with 9% growth rate, which lasted for about 2 decades. And if we can now move to a higher growth rate pattern of 12% per year for the next 10 years, India would become the #2 country in the world, overtaking China. That's the promise India holds. You take that risk and come, I don't think you will be unfairly deprived of an opportunity to prosper in India. Thank you very much.